Since the release of AI photo generators, I've stumbled across a few different renderings of some aquarium guitars floating around the web, and they honestly look pretty cool. It's an idea I've had in the back of my mind for a while now, and it's also been suggested a lot by you guys in the past, but I never truly thought that it would look good as a guitar. Seeing these AI renderings gave me the inspiration I needed to finally give it a shot. This is the aquarium guitar. I started out by making a template of the shape I want the guitar to be in, and then I transferred that onto some pink insulation foam and routed out the shape. I did this on 2 separate foam sheets so that I'd be able to make it as thick as I need it to be. Drilled some guide holes through the foam pieces, and then used some spray adhesive to combine both layers of foam. I'm keeping both the outer pattern and inner pattern, which I'll use to make a mold for the guitar. Cut out a section on the bandsaw, which will end up being my neck mounting area. So obviously I'm building an aquarium guitar. The guitar is going to need to be clear in order for it to be an aquarium. But in order for me to make a clear guitar, I need to replicate the shape that I want the guitar to be in with some kind of material so that I can make a mold. I chose foam to do this just because it's easy to work with and it has some flexibility to it, and that'll come in handy later on in this process. Glued down the outer template onto a sheet of whiteboard material and ran some silicone on the edges where the mold meets the whiteboard. I'm going to try building this guitar or aquarium out of epoxy. I could have tried building this whole guitar out of acrylic instead of epoxy, but my reasoning was that it's going to be easier to incorporate the neck pocket into the design with epoxy, and also with this method I don't need to glue any pieces together since I'm essentially making the entire thing out of glue. So there's not really any actual seams on the body that I need to worry about leaking. Maybe I'll give acrylic a shot if I end up doing another version of the aquarium guitar, but for this one, I'm using epoxy. Got some thickset epoxy poured into the mold, and then I covered it up and let it cure. All done with the pour. Hopefully this works out.
That doesn't look right.
So obviously this is not good. I realized shortly after I poured that I had mixed up the thickset epoxy wrong. It's a 3-to-1 ratio and I mixed it as a 2-to-1, which means that there was just way too much hardener in it. I kind of just crossed my fingers and hoped it would work out, but it obviously did not. For as much as I work with epoxy, I still find a way to screw it up sometimes. Just gotta read the label every time. This thing's all yellowed. For the most part, the shape is right, but it's not gonna work for this guitar, so you gotta make a new one. Alright, went with green foam this time, and I already got it cut to shape, but I'm thinking about altering the design a tad just to make things easier for when it's an aquarium. So when it's mounted to the wall, I want it to be resting basically parallel with the ground, and because of that, I can add an access port up top here to reach inside the aquarium. I had originally planned on adding the access port over here on the horn, but there's just not enough room to access coming from this direction. So I'm going to redesign this to make the top of the guitar in line with the horn, which will give me room to make an access port. It would have helped if I redesigned this prior to remaking the mold, but it's close enough to where I can just cut out the addition that I want and take it from the outer mold and add it to the inner mold. This kind of ended up being a little blessing in disguise that the first pour didn't come out well, because it would have really left me with an incredibly awkward access port into the aquarium. So now that I'm redoing it, I can make it how it should have been all along. Used aluminum tape on this one as it's wider, therefore there won't be any tape seams on the epoxy after I pull it out from the mold. Mixed up a new batch of thickset, this time using the correct ratio, and filled up the mold. Three days later, I popped this thing open and started on releasing my piece from the mold. Alright, here's what I've got. The texture on the epoxy, mainly on the outer edge, is wavy like this due to the aluminum tape, but obviously I'll sand this whole thing smooth. I started out by sanding the interior wall smooth, went from 150 up to 320 grit, drilled out a hole which will be for the output jack, and then routed out my access port, which is going to allow me to reach inside of the aquarium, and I basically went as large as I could with it given the space available. Now I needed to come up with a way to keep my electronics waterproof, which in this case is literally just one pickup. I started out by cutting some acrylic. I think this was 16th inch acrylic, and I used a heat gun to bend it into a rectangular box shape. And then I cracked the thing trying to drill out a hole for the wires. So restarted on a new one, drilling out the hole first. Glued some little acrylic end caps onto the box using some acrylic glue. Sanded all the edges flush, and I tried out flame polishing the acrylic, which sort of worked, but I also don't think the heat is good for the glue joints. But this thing's not going to be visible on the guitar, so it didn't really matter much if it's pretty or not. Added some silicone on the joints just to make sure it's 100% waterproof. Then I took a little piece of acrylic tubing and siliconed that into place inside of the box. And this is my finished pickup electronics box for the Aquarium guitar. So now I coated the entire interior wall of the guitar frame in epoxy. I could have just polished the existing walls instead, but that would just be incredibly tedious given the geometry. The exterior walls still have yet to be sanded smooth, which is why you can kind of see the wavy finish on it. Place that down on another sheet of whiteboard and silicone the edges of the body. Carefully placed my pickup box into the body, and I used a little piece of tin just to weigh it down. This little box isn't silicone to the whiteboard, so it's gonna fill up with epoxy to some degree, but I'll be able to route that epoxy back afterwards, so it's not gonna be an issue. I also made up this little epoxy backing to support the bridge. It's the same exact size as the bridge, and I'll take this and hover it slightly into the epoxy that I'm gonna pour so it gets bonded. Mixed up another cup of thickset and poured that into my guitar, which will create the face of the guitar body. Now the face of the guitar is finished, and I need to add the backside of the guitar, which will be done essentially the same way. But first I needed to sand just a small strip of the edge to allow the backside pour of epoxy to bond to the frame correctly. Also waterproofed the acrylic tube to the wall of the guitar so that no water will seep out from this hole. This is just a little piece of whiteboard that got stuck to the epoxy. Sealed the edges once again and poured in epoxy through my access port to create the back of the guitar body. Got the front and back done. Now it's time to see if it holds water. So this area is going to be one of the main concerns as far as leaks go. Doesn't seem to be any right now though. I haven't routed out this pocket yet, but it's hollow in there and it doesn't seem to be leaking any water into it, so that's good. Really only two areas that could potentially leak. Looks like it's holding water, so that's a good start. I want to get this thing mounted on a wall like I mentioned earlier, and the plan is to have substrate down here on the bottom, and then I can have my plants growing vertically this way. I just got to make a mount for this thing to rest on. I traced the bottom pattern onto a piece of wood to make a template. And then I took a couple boards of birch wood and laminated them together to make a big block of wood, traced my template onto it, and cut it to shape on the bandsaw. Took some more birch and made a few cuts on the table saw to build a wooden box, which will basically be a mantle that'll sit above the guitar and hang the aquarium light from, and also hold some of the aquarium components. Stained both pieces a dark brown and added on a felt liner to the top of the guitar mount so it doesn't scratch the guitar. Screwed it to a wall in my house, and that's pretty much it for the guitar mount. And now to finishing the guitar. I went ahead and routed out all the pockets, which for this guitar I'm keeping it all very simple. Just a neck pocket and then routing out the bit of epoxy that's left covering the pickup pocket. Drilled out some holes to mount the neck to the body, flushed up the acrylic tube to the guitar. I made a custom pickup ring out of walnut. I had to do this because the shape and size of the pickup cavity is too large for a standard pickup ring, so I just made one out of walnut, which I think will look pretty good on this guitar. I drilled out some guide holes for my bridge position, and I had to really make sure that I don't go too deep and into the actual aquarium. And then I just sanded all the surfaces on the guitar smooth and followed that up by adding a round over to the body. Sprayed on a few coats of 2K urethane and wet sanded and polished it up. In my experience, it's a lot easier to get a nice clear scratch-free surface if I just sand up to 320 grit and then clear coat that with urethane and then wet sand and polish the urethane, opposed to just wet sanding the epoxy all the way up to 2000 grit and then polishing. For me, it's less elbow grease this way, and I've never been able to achieve a perfect scratch-free finish on epoxy, whereas with the 2K urethane, it's pretty easy. All right, looking pretty clear now. Just gotta clean out the inside with water. I'm beginning to realize how tedious the maintenance on this thing is gonna be once it's an aquarium. I was worried about water spots on the inside of the guitar, so I used some pressurized air and knocked down most of the water. Now I'm getting all the hardware and electronics installed, which is essentially just a bridge, pickup, and an output jack. Going for the simplicity of things with this, which will also give me the max space inside of the guitar for the aquarium. Output jack will eventually get siliconed into the tube. I whipped up a quick maple and rosewood neck, nothing special going on with the neck here. Got that bolted to the body, strung it up, and gave it a quick sound test. I added this little aluminum bracket just to make sure that the guitar doesn't tip over when it's full of water. I've owned a few aquariums throughout my years, but overall I'm pretty much a novice when it comes to this stuff. But I'd always seen pictures of these incredible planted tanks, and there's a style of planted aquariums called Dutch style, and they look super cool. Lots of really vibrant plants, and I've always wanted to make one, so this was my chance. Except it's in a guitar. So I can't get this substrate to completely fill in over the electronics tube. I've tried to push little pellets in between the gap, but it's just too slim of a gap. Also tried crushing some, but they just don't seem to hold in the gap. So I'm just gonna hope that over time, once the substrate is saturated, it'll fill that area in. We got two different stem plants and this little carpeting plant, which should spread on the floor. They don't look like much right now, but that should change over some time. Planting these plants is one of the more tedious tasks I've ever done over the years building guitars. It's just kind of awkward to do because I can't really reach all the way in from the access port. And these plants are fairly delicate, but I had to get a good portion of them submerged into the substrate. It's kind of like playing a game of Operation, except instead of setting off a buzzer, you just kill a plant instead. I put the taller plants where the tank is taller and the carpeting plant closer to the middle of the body where it's more shallow. I'm setting this guitar up as a high-tech tank, so it's going to have a powerful light over it and CO2 injection to hopefully get these plants nice and vibrant. So I didn't account for this. See those varying water lines? It's because the air's trapped in the horn and doesn't have anywhere to escape to. I could drill a small hole on top of the horn, or what I'm gonna try first is just using a siphon to equalize the pressure, which should level out the water. Added a little power head to provide some flow. Got the CO2 system set up right in line with the water flow. Now I'm just gonna let it do its thing for a few weeks and hopefully these plants don't die. Here we are, the completed aquarium guitar. Honestly, really happy with the way it came out looking. This is about 3 weeks of growth and a few trimming since. Trimming the plants helps them grow more stems and gives them a little bit more of a bushy appearance. As always, I'll do a demo here at the end of the video, but first I want to cover a few things. First being that it's an aquarium and there's no fish in it. There's only about 1.5 gallons of swimmable water in this tank, and it's not really big enough to house any kind of fish, especially since it's such a thin tank. I considered adding some snails or shrimp, and I actually did add some shrimp to the tank. 3 tiny little cherry shrimp. They're incredibly tiny, and I acclimated them and added them to the tank. This was 4 or 5 days ago. And they were doing well, kind of just cruising around the tank, hopping from leaf to leaf. I left for a few hours and returned, and I couldn't find them. Then I realized that my power head, which I added to provide water flow, wasn't providing any water flow. Tragedy. My little shrimp apparently got sucked into the power head, and I just fished them out of this intake. Yeah, they're dead. I should have seen this coming because of how small they are. And apparently I was supposed to add a little sponge filter to the bottom of this so that it can't suck anything up like my shrimp. I know that now, but obviously it's too late. Damage has been done. So yeah, the shrimp test was an absolute disaster. I think I'm just gonna keep it with plants for now, let them grow in more, and maybe at some point in the future I'll add a sponge filter and try the shrimp again, or add a snail or something. Aside from that, just a few things about the guitar. On the bridge support that I added, there's like 1,000 of tiny air bubbles in the epoxy. And it must have been due to the way I hovered it over the epoxy pour. There was no room for the bubbles to escape, and they become really apparent under the light, but it kind of looks cool. There are some CO2 or oxygen bubbles that get trapped on the side here or on the top where there's not really a way for them to escape out of the tank, but that's also not a huge issue. Still have a little air pocket on this horn, I guess a bit of a design oversight. I should have made this horn slightly lower than the top of the guitar so it could completely fill with water, but then I'd still get bubbles trapped over there, so it's really not a huge deal. These stem plants are growing super fast, and I'm kind of wondering whether that's just because they grow fast in general or it's because they have the most access to direct light. If you compare those to the carpeting plant, which is getting its light completely through the epoxy top, which is dampening the output of the light some, it's growing, but it's not growing as fast as the stem plants. But regardless, even the carpeting plant has made some pretty good progress. I'll say this thing's an aquarium first and a guitar second, and with that I didn't put too much emphasis on the playability of the actual guitar. It's pretty heavy and awkward to hold, and you gotta make sure you don't spill it when you're playing it. It doesn't play like a dream, but it's definitely playable. Might give an update on this in a few months once it's grown in more, but for now I'll leave you guys with the demo here. Thanks for watching the build, and I'll see you all in a bit with the new project. Ergonomics on this thing are not very good. Never want to spill your guitar.